From Luke 22. Then they seized Jesus and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. But Peter was following at a distance. When they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. About an hour later, a third person kept insisting, surely this man was also with him, for he is a Galilean. But Peter said, Man, I do not know what you're talking about. At that moment, while he was still speaking, the cock crowed. The Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered how he had said to him, Before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly.
Now let's be clear. We were all terrified that night when Jesus was arrested. All the warnings about what would happen, his predictions. I just thought he were over-dramatising. I told him, didn't I? We'd never let such a thing happen to him. He was the promised one, God's Messiah, his son, even if we couldn't work out exactly what that meant. His father surely wouldn't let him suffer the grisly fate of some petty criminal at the unclean hands of Roman occupiers. The others had all run for it. Even I did, first off, once things turned nasty. After all, I were the one who'd slice someone's ear off so there'd be a price on my head too, like as not. But Jesus made it plain that bloodbaths are not us. He almost seemed content to be seized. Was this not the cup his father had prepared for him? Surely not. We'd all said we would die with him, though, before we risked coming back to Bethany when Lazarus died. Those 3 years we'd been on the road with him. He'd made loads of friends, gathered hundreds of supporters, though most were poorer folks, of course. But he'd made some powerful enemies too. You don't need many of their sort to change a game. The Romans, why, they weren't much bothered as long as there were no civil unrest. But the minute the temple hierarchy started getting rattled, the Romans never understood us Jews, but they wanted to keep the peace, keep it from the emperor's ears. Old Paunchy Pilate, he needed to keep his slate clean if he were to climb any higher up the ladder. The merest hint of trouble, and he'd be off to Ultima Thule in a handcart, or worse. We did mean it, about putting ourselves in the firing line for him, but in the heat of the moment, good intentions, bravado, just sort of evaporate. It all seemed so unreal. One minute we were that exhausted we kept nodding off on lookout duty. The next, this big mob shows up with torches and weapons and temple guards. And our old mate Judas, of course. We might have legged it, but we hadn't actually sold him for a few paltry denarii. I were gutted over that business in the high priest's yard, though, you can imagine. I've rerun it that many times over and over in my head. But that look Jesus gave me after the cock crowed. How could I have done that to him? Evil flourishes, you know, when good people do nought. I'd betrayed him every bit as much as Judas lied, just to save my worthless hide. Jesus had told us repeatedly that this life were no dead end. His Father's house holds many dwelling places, or summat. But if blokes want to drive nails through your hands and your feet, hoist you up on the gallows and hang you out to dry, it's hard to stick with a programme. I told myself it would be disastrous if we were all arrested and executed, but Jesus wouldn't want that anyway. I wasn't the only one with a wife and bairns, and who'd be carrying on his work after he were gone? But you know, it were just like when I couldn't walk on the water. "Where's your faith?" he asked when I began to sink. Then he had to haul me out. It were not an "I told you so" look across the firelit courtyard. Not even blameful, really, even though I'd lied. Just resignation, I suppose. I'd no idea then that he would rescue me yet again. Forgive me, even. Completely rebuild my faith. Show me again the man who'd stilled that raging storm, opened eyes, liberated captives, fed the hungry, raised the dead, even came back from it himself to prove a point. None of us knew what we were dealing with, even after all we'd shared, the ground we'd covered, the vision up the mountain, and Lazarus. Up by the lake, after he'd risen, he asked me, did I love him? I proper squirmed. But then he asks me twice more. Suddenly, I got it. Genuine love, hope, and absolute faith leave no room for fear. A cross would be agony, but it wouldn't be the end. Peter was the nominal leader of Jesus' apprentices, yet he still let his friend and master down. He couldn't understand why this extraordinary person who could do, the impossible in God's name, simply submitted to an appalling and shameful fate when he could, at the very least, have left the city and laid low for a while. Instead, Jesus had stuck to his collision course with the temple authorities, even though he knew where that would lead. He had made no attempt to deter or foil the treacherous Judas, even though he'd realised what was going on. For all his bravado, courage and faith failed Peter when the crisis came. In fact, he let Jesus down 3 times over, repeatedly falling asleep instead of keeping watch in Gethsemane, resorting to violence when the arrest took place, and finally breaking the commandments by denying he knew Jesus at all. Peter must have felt that Jesus' lonely and degrading death was all his fault. Far from being Jesus' rock, he was more like some sea-worn pebble, unstable and small. But as before his death, the risen Jesus gives Peter a second chance, enabling him to take on the fully delegated mission. The tasks and situations ahead would be perplexing, tense, demanding, and dangerous. But it seems that Peter has learned from his failures. In the very earliest days of their association, he had told Jesus he was a sinful man, yet he had still become a foundation of the enduring, if still imperfect, church. and saved millions more lives than just his own.